Thank you very much for joining this New Zealand Sign Language webinar today. I'm going to be focusing on the visual grammar of New Zealand Sign Language. My name's Rachel McKee. I'm an Associate Professor at the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies, and I'm going to be hosting today's webinar. Just to let you know, we'll be using the Q&A function, so if you'd like to submit a question related to anything you hear today, I'll aim to answer as many questions as I can at the end of the session. So before I get into some of the interesting ways that New Zealand Sign Language grammar works, I'd like to spend a few moments addressing some quite common misperceptions about sign languages in general. I found that even though people now are generally much more aware about sign language than they were, say, a decade ago, these underlying myths are still quite common because so few people have learned or studied a sign language. So worldwide, these three particular myths are very common: that sign language is universal, that it's the same around the world, that sign language is a code or a corresponding match for a spoken language, and that sign language is very like mime or imagery, more so than being a grammatical language. So these myths not only create confusion, but they also affect attitudes to deaf people who use sign language, and they have real consequences for decisions about how sign language should be used, for example, in the education of deaf children. So perceptions do matter, and I thank you today for coming along to become better informed about some of these ideas. So the number one FAQ in my life is, sign language is a universal language, right? And then when I say no, oh, it's not? Why not? Well, my answer to that is, how and why could any language be universally developed and used and passed on? Language communities, of course, arise in places with particular histories among local networks of people. And localness is especially true for languages that are used only in a face-to-face form, that haven't historically been in print or in broadcast media. So just taking a quick look at the signs for two concepts, man and woman, across 4 national sign languages confirms quite clearly that the universality of signs is really a myth. You can see that in Japanese, American, Pakistani, New Zealand sign languages, the sign for man takes completely different forms and the sign for woman takes completely different forms. So just the simple difference in vocabulary blows the myth that it's a worldwide universal language. Another very common idea about sign languages is that they're based on the words and the grammar of a spoken language, almost like a corresponding code for a language. Well, if we take a quick look at the vocabulary in sign languages, this shows us that this is not the case. Sign languages have independent ways of creating meaning. So, for example, in English, for some reason, the verb run can be used to express a range of meanings, as you can see in these 4 phrases: run around, run a meeting, run away, run out. But in NZSL, on the other hand, there's a wider set of vocabulary to express each of these different meanings using a different sign and a single sign for each of those types of meanings: the physical run, to run a meeting, to run away, or to run out of something, are completely different concepts. So they don't correspond to the vocabulary of English in a one-to-one mapping. Sign languages have their own semantics or their own ways of expressing meaning, and often this is based on visual metaphors. So since sign languages develop in communities of deaf people, precisely because they don't hear a spoken language, it's logical that sign languages are not going to arise from or be based on a spoken language. Signs are made with the hands, and using sign language involves the body and the face. And so it's quite often assumed that they're more or less like gesture or mime or visual imagery, which is fairly transparent or obvious in meaning. And there is some truth to this, because sign languages, of course, do incorporate gestures from a surrounding culture, and they do use elements of mime and imagery, especially to describe actions or spatial information. But what makes sign languages languages is that they're used regularly by a community of people who share conventional rules for combining parts of that language to create specific meanings. in the same way that you would combine words and grammatical structures in English to make yourself understood to other speakers. So we don't improvise language as we go along in signed or spoken language. You have to learn and know the symbols or the words, and you have to know the structures and how it fits together to use it and understand it. Now we're going to take a look at how sign language grammar uses the features of the face and space in particular linguistic ways. As I've said, sign languages exploit the possibilities of a visual medium to create grammar in ways that make visual sense. So one example of this is that the face signals the syntax or the intent of a sentence. A statement and a question are often differentiated not by the order of the signs or words, but actually by what's happening on the face. So as you can see in these illustrations, a closed or a question that expects a yes or a no answer is shown by raised brows, while open questions, or those that are seeking information, are signaled by a brow frown or lowered eyebrows. Notice that the top sentence without the raised brows would be a statement, meaning I've finished work. It only becomes a question when the brows are raised. So that's a syntactic use of the face to express the intent of a question. You might also notice if you look at the literal signs here, which are work finish and name what, that they seem to be lacking a second person pronoun. Well, that's because when a signer addresses a question directly to someone that they're looking at, the you meaning is assumed in that direct eye gaze. So there's no need to sign you. Are you finished work, or what is your name? It's implicit in the eye gaze. So this kind of facial grammar is quite systematic. And actually the question grammar, using the eyebrows, in some ways sort of echoes natural facial gestures and also the type of vocal intonation that we use, rising or falling, for different kinds of questions. The face is also used to add or build up another layer of meaning with verbs. So in English, we use adverbs to express the way or the manner in which an action is done, such as to type carelessly, to listen intently, to walk drunkenly. But in NZSL, the hands can carry the verb while the face carries an adverb. So these three pictures show different manners of writing. The verb on the hands is to write, and these particular facial features are very commonly used with other verbs as well to express these typical types of manner, to do something in a relaxed fashion, or to do something in a sloppy, inattentive fashion, or to do something intensely. Another kind of visual grammar that's found in all sign languages actually is the use of specific facial expressions to describe things more precisely, especially degree or intensity and manner, as we just said. So here in this first picture, we see a signer describing very fine mist rising from the grass in the morning. And the quality of fineness, or very fine, is expressed by his mouth shape, his puckered up mouth, and his narrowed eyes. And that same expression can be applied to describing any very thin or fine object. In the second picture, he's expressing a scorching hot sunny day, or the sun shining very intensely. And the intensity of heat from the sun is shown by the combination of his mouth and his eyes. And that same sort of combination can be used with other adjectives to describe extremely far, or extremely big, or extremely angry, for example. Also interesting in these pictures is that a rather unique capacity of sign language grammar is that a signer can be describing an event or an action or an object while also showing the perspective of a person observing it or the object experiencing it. So he's showing on his face something about the perspective of the observer or the experiencer. And of course that's possible because he can coordinate two ways of articulating meaning on the face and on the hands. Space is a very important grammatical resource in New Zealand Sign Language. Movement is a really efficient and economical way to show the relationships between actors and actions. So these pictures show how a transitive verb such as give, which involves a giver and a receiver, can use direction to show who's giving to whom, using different points in the signing space to represent first, second, and third person pronouns. So from the body outwards as I give to you, from the body out to one side as I give to a third person, or across the body is third person gives to another third person. So this is an example of how signed sentences do not correspond to spoken sentences, because here we can see that one sign neatly contains three elements of meaning by using space and movement. Because signs exist in three-dimensional space and signs can move, they naturally take advantage of this, the ability to map signing space. And so the direction of movement is especially useful for representing actions that involve someone else, such as give or ask or explain or look at. And there are two parts of this. Firstly, a signer will index or sort of set up points in their signing space by looking towards a certain direction or by pointing to a referent in the signing space, maybe to the left or the right or the center. And then verbs or actions can be directed between those. So in the sentence that I'm going to show you in this short video, the signer is saying, my children were sick and I took them to the doctor and explained to the doctor what was wrong with them. So I've put some little icons here to represent the perspective of the signer as the mother, the first person, I the mother, the children, and the doctor. And you can see where they're located literally in the signing space. And she will use three verbs. She'll use take, go to, and explain. And you'll see how she directs them to the different entities in the space. The children were sick. I took them, went to the doctor, and explained to the doctor what was wrong with them. So you can see very clearly how the signer has a mental map in her head of where the children are and where the doctor are, and then she makes these inflecting verbs agree with those directions of the different parties. And the person watching also, of course, has to build that mental map in their head of the reference in this sentence. One interesting thing about our brains is that our eyes can perceive and send a more complex package of visual information to the brain compared to the amount of sound signals that we can hear and process in a simultaneous way. So if you compare, say, 20 seconds of looking at a picture and what you can retain compared to 20 seconds of listening to music of what you can retain, usually you'll have a lot more visual detail because the brain can absorb that in a simultaneous rather than a linear fashion. And so because sign language is produced on the body and in space, signers can take advantage of this to express more than one bit of information at the same moment, which is why when we describe sign language syntax, it's often not about word order as such, but about the simultaneous combining of different elements. So in this slide, we see examples from a travel narrative where the signer uses her two hands to express related pieces of information about one proposition or event. In the left-hand picture, I flew up from Jamaica to Cuba. On her left hand, she is flying with a plane on a south to north axis, while she uses her right hand to point to anchor the destination of Cuba. So those two things can be expressed at the same time. While on her face, you can see that she's also adding an adverb to express that the flight was long and slow, as in I flew all the way up to. In the right-hand picture, she's holding a document with her left hand to represent a visa, but on her right hand, she's signing nothing, indicating that she didn't have the document. And again, her face is actually expressing her perspective on that situation. So it's very simultaneous packaging of information using the two hands and the face to express a lot of reference at the same time. The last thing I'd like to talk about is how sign languages have the potential to represent abstract concepts in a visually metaphorical way. So one example of this is that signs with time-related meaning use space and movement to talk about time metaphorically as if it were an object that could be placed on a physical timeline from left to right or from back to front. Also, there's a lot of visual metaphor in verbs. So in English, where we might alter the meaning of a verb to make it negative or opposite, we could add a prefix such as or miss, such as understand, misunderstand. In sign language, we can use movement in a metaphorical way. So at the top, we have the sign understand, which in itself is a metaphor. It's the idea of something popping up in the head. And in the sign next to it, went past my eyes. This is a metaphor for an idea or information flying past the eyes. So meaning to not understand, to misunderstand, or to miss out on something. Because of course, for a deaf person, understanding comes through the eyes. So going past is metaphorically not taking in the information. On the lower half is the sign communicate, which is a metaphor for two-way exchange between people. And then for miscommunicate, one of the hands drops out or falls down. So the action of the falling or the dropping metaphorically expresses to miscommunicate or for communication to break down. So there are many ways that the vocabulary and the grammar of sign language can be visually motivated and metaphorical in this way. So that's all we have time for today in terms of grammar, but I hope it's been an interesting small glimpse into some of the ways that New Zealand Sign Language grammar works. Thank you very much for coming.